Well, thank you for joining for my talk today on languages and the deconstruction of language hierarchies. We're in this polyglot conference, right? And we are all polyglots. We love languages, and we tend to speak the same kind of languages, but there are also people who tend to really try to learn exotic languages, for instance, and then there are languages that are called hierarchies, and this is the focus of today's talk, and also what we can do to kind of deconstruct the stigma that evolves around languages, sometimes perceived as either less prestigious or more prestigious. For instance, when we compare languages such as English, for instance, to Czech or Albanian, which are sometimes perceived as less prestigious. So in my work, I am a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. What I do is I look at how to do that in a way, and I look at how society interacts with languages around, how languages interact and kind of construct society. So I hope this is not too academic for you. So I'm not mad if you decide to leave, so feel free. But also, please, if you have any questions, I'd really appreciate it. Yeah, if you put them in, ask me later after the talk. So yeah, this is my agenda for today. I will look at heritage language speakers. Who are these people who speak these languages as a first language? Not necessarily those who learn them, but that would be really interesting to look at as well. I look at heritage languages in Switzerland. I will show you some. I will give you some information on the study context that I'm embedded in. I will talk a little bit about the Languages Act, about the policy or legal framework that these languages are embedded in, and then also I will present 3 studies that I have conducted myself. The first on cognitive migration, the concept of cognitive migration instead in comparison to physical migration. Maybe some of you are familiar with this already. The second, so teachers, so those people who have it as a job to actually teach these languages in a different country context. And then in the third study, I look specifically again at heritage language teaching, at the conditions, working conditions also for those teachers, but also what it means to actually be a language teacher. And I'm sure some of you are very familiar with that, and I appreciate any kind of comments you would have. And then I'll try to conclude. Yeah, as I was saying, heritage are specific. Right? They're a little bit different than these typical foreign languages that we learn in school, for instance. They're definitely not our first language when we have them as a heritage language, because it's something that we carry with ourselves in a way. It's something similar to culture, but sometimes not really expressed, because sometimes we are in a context where that language isn't spoken. We're in a context where that kind of language might not even be allowed to be spoken. So a heritage language speaker, if we look at the literature that in academia, is defined as a simultaneous or sequential successive bilingual whose weaker language corresponds to the minority language of their society and whose stronger language is the dominant language of that society. So maybe you can think about whether this definition even applies to you. Would you define yourself as a heritage language speaker? And again, feel free to comment in the chat on that if you do identify such. So questions would be, though, and maybe also if you have answers to that, feel free to also contribute in the chat. Who counts as native versus non-native? We use these terms kind of without thinking about them, I feel sometimes a bit recklessly almost. And it has been criticized in the literature that native can also refer to indigenous. And then what is the difference again between indigenous, heritage, native, right? Like who counts as a native and who doesn't, and what consequences follow from these categorizations, and who is responsible for these categories. And also, what label or category fits really for whom. So when we look at successive bilingual, so we have to define which language was learned first and who learns these languages. Is it the parents that teach us these languages, or is it, again, as said in the definition later on, the society, and how to teach us a language, right? So how we position ourselves as speakers in such an environment, and how do we learn from that? And also, again, how is this information gathered, right? So who goes around in society, if it's that broad already, and asks people, well, do you speak a heritage language? And again, so who gathers this information, and how is it disseminated? It's just me being a bit critical when it comes to this definition and to this concept of heritage language. Although it's very important that we have it, I feel we really need to be also critical when it comes to using terminology in language sciences. All right, overview on Switzerland, just a development. I'm sure it's similar to other societies. And again, if you happen to see any similarities, parallels, or also what is really strikingly different from your country context, please feel free to add. So Switzerland is a multilingual country already officially. It has 3 official languages and 4 national languages that count as official in a policy framework. So we have German, or Swiss German. For those of you who know the difference, you will know that it's quite substantial. French, Italian, or Italian dialect spoken in Ticino or Crison. And then we have Romansh, which is the only heritage or indigenous language in Switzerland, meaning that it's the only one that is not borrowed from the neighboring countries. And then we have other languages, and surprisingly, or not so surprisingly actually, we have a trend here that other languages are increasing, whereas the national languages are decreasing, except for French. So, and Romansh has remained fairly stable over the years. So this is from 1970 through fairly impressive that with 22.7% of speakers of other languages now in Switzerland. And right, so what are these languages? And we have a study from 2005, Ludi and Verlin. They have looked at what kind of languages exist, what languages qualify as heritage languages in Switzerland. And back in 2000, these are the numbers that we have for 2000. Serbian or Croatian is the most populous one, then Albanian, Portuguese, Spanish, and so on. And the last ones are Thai, Kurdish, or Macedonian. So I will now show you numbers for 2019, and you will see that this has changed quite substantially. We have now English spoken by 6.5% of the population, Portuguese still at the top, and Albanian as well. So, and interesting, when we look at the other spectrum, we have Tigrinya. I'm sure some of you have heard of this language before, and it's interesting because we see that there's a discrepancy between what type of language is actually displayed here. So English typically is considered to be a more prestigious language, a language that is learned by many people. And in the Swiss context, it is spoken by many expats. If we in Switzerland, there are all these multinational companies. For instance, there's Google, there's Nestle, and we have many expats coming from English-speaking countries also live and in Switzerland and speak that as a heritage language. We could argue that this might not really be a heritage language. It might be better described as English as a lingua franca. But yeah, again, that's what I was saying before. We have to be critical with these terminologies that we use. But Tigrinya, for instance, is a real heritage language. So it's also, it came to Switzerland through forced migration from people from African countries, bringing Tigrinya into Switzerland. And we have now a substantial increase in that language. And I wouldn't be surprised if Tigrinya became even more prominent in Switzerland's linguascape. All right. What do in Switzerland with other languages? How do they interact, and kind of trouble do they cause, maybe, if you want to put it that way? Because there is a Languages Act that is actually a legal document. It's a law. It's a federal act on the national languages, and it has several aims. So 4 of those I have listed here, which I find very interesting, because they do not mention multilingualism per se. It's always, the focus is always on Switzerland's quadrilingualism, 4 languages, right? Like the Swiss, German, French, Italian, and Romansh. So the aim of the Language Act is to strengthen quadrilingualism as one of Switzerland's fundamental characteristics, to consolidate the internal cohesion of the country, to encourage and institute plurilingualism in the national languages, and to preserve and promote Romansh and Italian as national languages. So here we have this focus, or if you want to say hierarchy, as I argue, that Switzerland's languages, national languages, those chosen by policymakers or politicians, are preferred to heritage languages and other languages spoken by either residents or citizens. And we have, really interestingly here, a priority on the 4 languages to consolidate the cohesion of the country. You could argue that speaking all these different languages, it might make it difficult to actually communicate among each other, right? And I would argue that that is the case. Encourage individual and institutional plurilingualism. So I said before that we don't have the concept of multilingualism present. We use plurilingualism in Switzerland, but it's basically the same thing. I just find it interesting that we open up the concept. We say pluri, meaning many, several, and then in the next 2 words, we restrict it already back again to only focus on national languages. So even these policy or legal texts, we have hierarchies, language, that I would argue need to be deconstructed if we want to be really multi or plurilingual. And yeah, in the 4th argument here, to preserve and promote Romansh and Italian as national languages, of course, there again is a hierarchy detectable, because it's only focused on Romansh, which, as you have seen in the graph, are those languages that are languages compared to the more dominant ones, which are Swiss German, German, or French. So, but still no mentioning whatsoever of all the languages that are also spoken in Switzerland, which are, for instance, 6.5% English compared to only 0.5% Romansh. That's just a side note, and for you to reflect on if you want. Languages Act, there are underlying principles. It shall ensure that it treats the 4 national languages equally. Swiss language, sorry, of course, another language hierarchy detectable here. It shall guarantee and apply linguistic freedom in all its areas of activity. So who gets to be free, right? The speakers of the national languages, but not the speakers of the heritage languages. It shall take account of the traditional composition of Switzerland's region. Who knows what that really is, and it shall promote understanding between the linguistic communities. So again, it's basically a repetition in a way of what was said before, but I'm just criticizing this in a way, saying if we want equality, then we have to be really equal and also combine the languages that are actually spoken in Switzerland. And if we want to talk about linguistic freedom, that means that we should be able to use our linguistic repertoires, our resources freely within, but that's not the case. I've experienced and have been to Switzerland and noticed that it's a pretty clear border between the German-speaking cantons, the French-speaking cantons, the Italian-speaking cantons. There's not a whole lot of communication actually happening among these cantons. So we could question this principle and even the whole Languages Act. Right. So after all theory, there's more theory, unfortunately, but I want to show you how I started with my how I applied this kind of theory that I had read to my own studies, looking at the first one, cognitive migration. What I did, my participants in the study were 13 university students. I gathered qualitative data, which are in this study language portraits, and I did focus groups, which are like interviews but with more people. And I applied Mortimer's concept of cognitive migration, and he argues that the process of cognitive migration is characterized as mentally experimenting with the physical, social, and of a specific future, time, and place. Right. So as I was saying before, when I introduced my study to you, I told you that when we migrate or even just move somewhere, go on vacation, we kind of prepare ourselves mentally, and we kind of imagine this place where we're going, and also is defined a lot by what language is spoken in that place. So interesting. And how I apply it here in my study is that I actually use language in this case, not only for these physical travels or movements, but for mental travels. And I draw on Corvallis for that, who says that it's not only our mental travel, but mental time travel, right? So we through language, we're actually able to talk about the past, the present, and the future. Just define characters, how we use language, human language. And so maybe you can think about how you prepare when you go some places, when you know you have to speak a different language. Of course, you get all excited because we're all polyglots, right? But other people who are forced to go somewhere because they have to flee their country, for instance, they don't have time to do Duolingo before, right? And like, I don't know, do a challenge and get to some efficient level before they actually go to that new country and then have to prove themselves already, either through academic records or professional environments, right? So think about what it means to actually migrate, and maybe you can think about, that's what I did, what does it mean cognitively? So how is it that language is already a part of our internal processes before actual physical migration? Right. And so here, that's one of the examples of my language portraits. And an interesting fact here is that this person was actually not physically moving because she's a second generation immigrant. But nevertheless, she in her language portrait showed that her heart was broken still after so many years living in Switzerland and having a Brazilian father, and being shaped by his experience, by his physical migration. And so we can see that cognitive migration can take place even when we're not physically moving or going anywhere. So that to me was very interesting, and that's something I just wanted to highlight here. And then another participant whose language portrait I find really interesting, because you can see the sign through the body. You can see, maybe detect there's a Czech flag on the left, and then we have the Swiss flag on the right, and even with different cantonal flags, we have Fribourg and Bern to represent that his linguistic repertoire is made up of different varieties within Swiss German. But we can also see that the part of his body that belongs to Swiss German is significantly bigger than the one that he allocated to Czech. And however, and that's the really, really nice part about the study, is that we talked about this in class, and then you can see this flash on top of the dotted line, and where it says Ziel, which means aim or objective. So after the class and after this activity, this person became aware of the fact that his heritage language was actually also a big part of his own life, of even his body, because he could use it when going somewhere, but not in Switzerland. So, and since he spends most of his time in Switzerland, he kind of allocated less space to Czech, but he said that he would be really happy to find more opportunities to actually use Czech, and that's why he has this flash moving, wanting to move the dotted line more equally, to have more equal parts allocated to both languages. So I thought that was really fascinating, and how we can combine our body with language. So this second study, really quickly, the setup was 6 heritage language teachers were from Greece. They were speakers of Greek, English, and German. And the data that I used were semi-structured, in-depth interviews. So they lasted between 45 minutes and 2 hours. And they were conducted in English over Zoom or over the phone. And so theoretical framework is, I draw on the concept of participative multilingual identity, which is embedded in interaction, environment, and community. And so the interesting part about this is that there are people who argue that we are in a state of constant becoming. We are always changing. And when we combine that with the multilingualism, it's interesting how we are constantly becoming someone else also through language. If you think about your learning experiences with languages, you will probably know that you can kind of pass as somebody else if you adopt a different accent, if and you have access to many more contexts. It could be register related. So for instance, academic language gives you access to university, to all kinds of like more sophisticated language, right? And then you have also completely different languages, which of course give you access to many more country contexts, for instance. So and when we look at multilingual identity, these people argue that you can you can always use your and continuously shape, aware of it or not. And instruction, of course, takes place over time. And there are development stages that you have to go through, and you always belong to certain communities, or you are a member of those, but you have to kind of gain access to these communities. It's not that they are given to you. And sometimes, as I was saying before, language can actually is like a key to actually have access to these communities. So for instance, could be one, or anything, right? Schools or work is sometimes also defined by language. Then we have all these socio-historical context, right? So as I was saying before, when I started my presentation, how does society interact with language, and the other way around? How does language interact with society? And this has obviously an important impact on our identity. And it's considered as active participative process, although certain features of the multilingual identity remain core. Right. So, and then Fisher et al., they argue that reflection about one's multilingual self precedes identification. Maybe I just want you to reflect on this quickly. What do you think about that? Do you think that we reflect on ourselves as multilingual speakers more so maybe than monolingual speakers? And do you then identify as a multilingual speaker after having reflected on it? And how does that shape your own identity? This is not something you have to share necessarily, but this is something for you to think about. Right. And back to this concept of cognitive migration, I also used this concept of imagined communities and identities, because what is our core ultimately? So what languages do we speak most? Are we most comfortable, know best, have learned the longest, or whatever? How do we, based on the proficiency maybe also, and to the extent we feel at ease when speaking those languages, what community do we want to belong to, and do we belong to? And again, many of you will speak many languages, and so maybe you are members of different communities, and maybe also when learning a language, you imagine to be member of such a community, or maybe you have been recognized as one with access to that kind of community, but you still imagine to have that identity and maybe also a membership to that community. And this is something that is used a lot in language studies, in linguistics, to construct multilingual identity. right? So complex emotions and identifications with multiple locations can to some degree be held through the mind, through cultural artifacts, and through a shared imagination. I'll just give you that quote, and you can think about what, how to what extent you agree with Cohen. And I really like this quote as well. Focus on the future when learners imagine who they might be and who their communities might be when they learn a language. So for language teachers among us, this is something that we give to students when they learn a language, right? We kind of provide with, and also imagination, how life could be if they were speakers of that and that language. And so that is really, I think that's a really nice idea, to look at language learning not only as resources, but also as a as opening up their horizons of where they might go. Right, so here I have some quotes for you that my participants gave me. So when we were talking on the phone or over Zoom, when we were doing these interviews, they were really engaging, and I really appreciate what they shared with me. So just for you to see how they perceive multilingual identity as heritage language teachers, so how they perceive and negotiate that kind of conflict between being a Greek speaker, a Greek, having a Greek identity, living in a foreign country, and having to teach one's first language as a heritage language. So for instance, one of them says, Greece is my home, my everything. Switzerland is the opportunity to have a better life and learn. It's kind of stressful, but also a very positive experience. Another one said, I'm not the same person when I interact with the Swiss people and when I interact with family or friends in Greece, where I'm different. I can't use the same jokes in Switzerland. We don't have this connection. And then the third person here says, I miss speaking Greek. It is important when you can express yourself in your mother tongue. And when we meet, we speak in our own language. We should speak German, but we don't. And then she laughs. So here we have, again, of course, the whole concept of language hierarchies present, and also a bit of a regret not speaking the national or the local language, because that would contribute to actually being a real member of the Swiss society. But on the other hand, we see that there is a kind of a disconnect because of language also, because we can't express the same things in a language that we don't master necessarily. And also humor or jokes are really hard to convey in a different language, that also not only from a linguistic point of view, but also culturally, right? So the interaction is just missing or a bit off. And for them, Greek gives them the opportunity to be themselves, and again, which contributes to their multilingual identity construction. And I like a lot is that this person says, I'm also trying to figure out the identity of my students. It's not the same as my identity. I grew up in Greece and I feel Greek. So you can imagine how difficult it must be to teach your own language to somebody who's a heritage language speaker, who's, as we saw in the definition of heritage language, has that language as a strong language necessarily, and also in a different context that you kind of are not familiar with. So in this is something we see in the next quote as well. The teacher who says, it took me a couple of months to adjust, to understand, to realize that I'm not in a Greek school in Greece. Because once I asked, where are you from in Greece? They were looking at me and didn't understand. They come from Switzerland. I am learning the Swiss culture now. I am new to that. I know very well in Greece, of course. So I know many things that I can't transmit to them. For them, Greece is a visit, in the best case, grandma and grandpa. So here we see these challenges again of what it means to be a heritage language teacher. And this is for you to also reflect on. Maybe you can share similar experiences, something that you would like to say to this, and please feel free to use the chat again for that. Right, and then another social aspect of this heritage language teaching is that, as this person says, I don't want to create schools for immigrants. The thing is, these students, they are separated from other students physically, institutionally. So these heritage language schools, they're not together with regular public schools. So they sometimes meet on a Saturday to have 4 hours of language class, and so we only get these immigrant students in a way in these situations, in these settings. And so what it feels like for some teachers is that they create separation, and whereas they want to actually create cohesion, right? But they actually feel like they're doing the opposite. But then there's also the positive thing is that they are embedded usually in a family setting where there is still the heritage language and culture very present. So this person says, as long as their parents or grandparents talk to them in that language, so as long as they have a place to visit, in Greece here, for instance, there is a village somewhere where grandpa comes from, that means that they're not only Swiss. So to what extent, again, does heritage language mean you can become a heritage language speaker if you don't have that community aspect, this culture aspect to it? Maybe not, right? So this is an open question again, like to you also. How do we feel what it means to be a heritage language speaker? All right, moving on to the third and last study I would like to present today. Heritage language teaching still the same teachers, 6 heritage language teachers from Greece, speakers of Greek, English, and German, and still using the same data set as before. A different here, identity formation processes. I don't have to go into detail with that. I'm sure you're familiar, but when we look, and I was hinting at that already, when we look at how these heritage languages are taught in Switzerland, I don't know how it is in other places. It's usually separated from the regular public school setting. So this is very difficult for teachers, although it is actually legally kind of promoted. Not as much as the languages as we saw in the beginning, but there is some recognition, and policymakers have acknowledged that heritage languages are indeed an important factor for development. And so, for instance, also heritage languages can prove economically important for Switzerland, but only if their speakers reach a certain proficiency level. So specific academic language skills are therefore encouraged, especially at secondary level. So we see again here with languages, because society can benefit from proficient heritage language speakers. So I think that is really interesting. So once the money comes in, right, once it's like financially lucrative, there is a certain incentive to also promote these languages institutionally and through policies. So subsidizing heritage languages is linked to better professional qualifications and lower expenditure welfare. It's pretty clear what the expectations are of these language speakers. It's to actually pay back the society for expenditures that they have through the heritage language teaching. So again, I'm being critical, but it's also on you to reflect what you think on that. What they say in the policies is that heritage languages are to be integrated into the classrooms through language awareness, using teaching materials such as the you all know the CFR language portfolio to showcase every student's potential and linguistic resources. And also they're to be promoted through these language culture of origin classes to take place at the children's regular schools. That's what they say in the document, at the regular schools, which is not the case. So here they even have a law saying the cantons allow LCO classes in public schools and invite to cooperate responsible for these classes. And another problem with the institutional setting that heritage language teaching is embedded in is that there's a low number of lessons. There are integrate learning groups, classes in off-peak hours in the afternoon or on weekends, longer commutes for both teachers and students, low salary for teachers, and a high fluctuation of learners. And so what do these conditions do with heritage language teaching and with the teachers? I have looked here and summarized the conditions that were explained to me by my participants, by the teachers, and then I have some quotes here again for you I'd like to share. So when you want to get better in your health, you go to the specialist. When you want to eat great food, you go to a good restaurant. When you have an electronic problem, it's the same thing. It doesn't mean because you speak that you can teach it in the way a teacher who studied for 4 years. This is unfair. It's not responsible for the teachers also, and the parents and the community, for everyone. So what this quote shows is that there is a problem, of course, when you're not recognized for having a diploma, for actually having done a study program that would qualify you as a heritage language teacher. And so some teachers have to teach, they just happen to speak that language and then find a job fairly easily. So, and then it's also perceived as doing a favor with the double or triple times of hours that you work than what you're paid for. So it's a bit of volunteer work. And also another person says they offer classes that they don't use, so classrooms that they don't use a lot, or they're old, or the chemistry laboratory, right? So if these are the settings that they describe to language classes. Another quote showing that, first of all, they have to teach on a Saturday. So every Saturday, you have to take away the desks and the chairs and everything, to have the kids always on the floor. In the winter, it's cold, and I have to find a carpet to bring it there, to put it down, take it away. Always the games, the toys. If I come to a class where I know there are my scissors, there are my papers, everything just ready, it would make it perfect lesson. We see that it can maybe learn the language more playfully, they're just not there, right? They're just not met. If you imagine teaching kindergarten aged students, children, in a chemistry lab, that's just not happening, right? That's just really difficult. And so another person says we have to be really, really careful about everything. When I leave the classroom, I clean everything because I don't want to leave traces like someone was in my classroom, right? So they feel like they're strangers, right? They feel like they don't belong to that classroom. I don't want to make a mess. That adds stress sometimes. It would be better for the children to have a place where they can put on the walls some of their paintings, of their writings. It would become more personalized. It would feel like they actually contribute to that space, which is, of course, also very important for language learning. And to conclude, after all the talking and these ideas and different concepts, I think we need to advocate a better representation of heritage languages on a social level, but also politically. It's already there politically, but it's not implemented, right? Legally, it's the same. We have some sort of understanding of what it would take, but it's still not happening. We need to live and celebrate true social multilingualism, not selectively, not saying, okay, we should promote Romansh and Italian because they happen to be national language in Switzerland. No, we actually need to look who are our people, what languages do they bring, and how can we help promote really true multilingualism. We also need to improve working conditions for heritage language teachers, because these are the people who help that heritage languages don't die out. And we have a tendency to only want to learn English, but forget about the linguistic resources that we already have. And then start learning less common languages. Yeah, that's on us as polyglots, right? Not just learn something really, really uncommon. And with that, I would like to conclude. Thank you so much for your attention.